So this last weekend, I was out with some friends. The plan was to go get a ramen. It was like a lemon spice pepper ramen. And then after that, go to an English pub. And it just so happened to be that this location was right next to Akihabara. And that's Electric City. So me looking on Google Maps, looking where the location is, I was like, hey boys, just stop for a second. I need to go just check out Electric City. Just go check out some stores, see what used PC parts are possibly on the shelves, because you never know. There just might be that deal that's on the shelf. And if you guys love used PC parts and the deals as much as I do, you have to take it. And that's when I walked into Junk Paradise. I was looking through some overpriced graphics cards, some mediocre priced graphics cards, decent prices on some things, but then this PC stood out right here. It was an i7 9700, 16 gigabytes of RAM, motherboard, decent case, power supply wasn't too shabby too. I quickly checked that out. 400 watt channel well, not too bad. I mean, it's not the absolute bottom of the barrel. It'll do the job. And then look at the storage, 500 gigabyte SSD and a 2 terabyte hard drive, but there's no GPU. Then I looked at the price and it was coming in around Salman N if you've got your tourist passport, which I happen to have. And that makes it about $187 US. And so for this price, with a 7-day warranty, I just had to get this thing and see what we could do in today's video in terms of coupling it with a GPU, as well as checking out the i7 9700 non-K, which is one of the weirdest CPUs from Intel, coming in with 8 cores, 8 threads. But let's take a look at why this CPU's been discontinued, but its predecessor, the i7 8700, hasn't been discontinued, right after today's video sponsor.
If you want to get rid of this annoying activate Windows message, then today's video sponsor SCD Keys has you covered for as little as $15 US. After you enter that coupon code BFTYC, you can cop yourself a legit single end user license today. Also works for Windows 11 Pro too. Links in description below.
Released in 2019, the i7 9700 as well as the 9700K was a bit of an oddball CPU from Intel. They released it with 2 more cores over the i7 8700, but they took away hyperthreading and then reserved that for the top spot in the list, at the time, the flagship i9 9900K. However, the price of this i7 9700 also increased at retail about $20 more than that of the 8700. However, in combination with another interesting fact, Intel left the level 3 cache size the exact same on the 9700 as it was on the 8700. And so all this led to one of the worst selling i7s in Intel's history, to the point where they quickly rushed out the next generation, 10th gen, with the 10700 now including hyperthreading. However, those negative points aside, let's take a look at the positives, which after tuning this thing up and going into the BIOS, there's actually a lot to love about this CPU before we even jump into the benchmarks, the gaming benchmarks, where we're going to be pitting that against, with the 4060 of course, against something like a 7950X3D to see how much you're missing out on. But this is a cheap H310 motherboard that we've got here. And even in a budget motherboard like this, we're still able to do a few things to make the performance as best as possible. One of those being undervolting, of course. It's something that I highly recommend. In this case, we don't have direct undervolting on the CPU, but ASRock's BIOS, even on a budget board like this, enables us to do a flat blanket undervolt across the V-core by 100 millivolts. And so this leads us in Windows to then drop down the maximum power consumption from around 130-ish watts down to around 110 watts. And this makes a huge difference on a budget board like this, especially for extracting maximum performance. And you might be thinking at this stage, Brian, it's only 20 watts. It is not gonna make a difference. On a budget board like this, it certainly does. When we're doing the temperature readouts on the VRM, we were going close to 120 degrees at the before undervolted settings. And then after the undervolted settings, we're now at around 100 degrees. Now, 100 degrees is still a little bit high, but keep in mind, this is a Cinebench benchmark, and it is using up generally a lot more power than what games will test at. But once we get onto the games, we will see the performance, but also the CPU core temperatures themselves, especially since we're using an Intel stock cooler here, manages to bring down those near 100 degrees Celsius temperatures all the way down to around 84 degrees. And the best thing is, we also gained 200 points on our Cinebench R23 multi-core performance. So undervolting is one thing, especially if you're on a budget, that you would want to take advantage of. But one more key bonus that was mixed in with all this was when I checked the idle desktop power consumption results, because it's something that I always include with whether it's a review on a graphics card or a budget build or something like that. We managed to get some of the best idle power consumption results I've ever seen. Something weird about this combination of a budget board and undervolting had it so that our whole desktop power consumption idle here was around 37 watts with that budget Channelwell 400 watt power supply. Extremely impressive, as before the undervolt it was hovering around 60 watts. Now maximum power consumption from the wall is also reduced, so saving up the micromanaged benefits here, we're going to be saving money on our power bill, we're going to be increasing the longevity of our motherboard, our CPU, and also we're going to be getting away with less noise on our CPU cooler because it's running at lower temperatures. Undervolting, ladies and gentlemen, just because the word under is in there, it does not mean it is bad. In fact, they should rename undervolting to amazing volting. However, in the BIOS, we were able to do a couple more things, and that was tune the memory, where we had a 2666 megahertz memory locked in from the get-go. I didn't want to play around too much, so I just dropped the latency of the CR timings, as well as the command rate down to 1 from 2. And this is actually going to give us an edge in gaming, considering we've got some real budget mismatched sticks of memory here. The final piece of the puzzle was extending the power limits in this BIOS, because usually when you get an H310 motherboard, it's going to throttle everything. But since we decided to undervolt and we're keeping the temperatures somewhat in check, we can then extend the power limits and get the most out of this i7-9700 in this particular setup. Anyhow, let's get onto the GPU we're using, then onto some gaming benchmarks. So we're now ready to boot up this computer, but you'll notice that we've added in a graphics card already. And this is the RTX 4060. Now we picked this up for a little over $200 on the used market. And so coupled in with this already cheap PC, we've got here an RTX 4060 PC for under $400. And there's also on the back of the case a Windows 10 Home OEM license, so we don't have to fork out any extra money for Windows on top of that. Now people be wondering, Brian, it's only got a 400 watt power supply. That's going to be not anywhere near enough. But with an RTX 4060, the beauty of this GPU is that it only requires a single 8-pin, and its power consumption is extremely good. It's one of the most efficient GPUs out there on the market. So coupling it with even a budget 400 watt power supply is going to be absolutely fine. I was actually going to try, which we might even later on in this video, put in an RTX 3070 and see if that can hold up with this budget rated power supply. But this is a huge contributing factor as to why the 4060 sells quite well, because a lot of OEM system builders can get away with using entry power supplies and still have quite good performance from the RTX 4060 in the form of a gaming PC. This smile right here is a smile that can only come from extracting used price performance out of the very best. And this comes from, first of all, when we get into these gaming benchmarks, which we'll pull up the numbers very soon, there was actually something really surprising that impressed me even more. And that was going to ASRock's website and looking up the BIOS updates for this particular old motherboard. It showed that there was a recent update, well, not so recent, but at least the end of last year, where you could update to a beta BIOS and get access to clever access memory. And this enables the resizable bar to now function, this option, which essentially in some games can enhance the FPS. So after updating this BIOS, we went into Windows, and when we pulled up GPU-Z, which can check if the resizable bar is enabled or not, it did indeed show it was enabled. So then we got onto the gaming benchmarks. So we've already undervolted our CPU, and then we got onto undervolting our GPU, which was always for RTX 4000 series cards. I like to have this around 2600 to 2700 megahertz with around a 950 to 960 millivolt level. And this indeed did save us a bit of power on the RTX 4060, not a whole lot. The RTX 4060 doesn't benefit as much as other GPUs, in especially the 3000 range, for example, from undervolting, but it does make a bit of a difference. And the good thing here is the performance is actually even better after we undervolt this GPU with these particular settings. Though moving on into the first game here, we tested out Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege. And here's where at 1080p, we managed to score over 300 average FPS with a minimum of 253. Now, the minimum is close. A lot of the times when I test games, the minimum is close to the 0.1% lows, which we will be testing out in the other two titles that we've played here. But this is an impressive result, especially when we compare it against the 7950 X3D setup, where the average FPS did lift up a bit, but it was only to the tune of roughly 25 average FPS, and the minimums even showed less of a difference. Then we stepped it up to 4K. Since my test monitor is 4K and DLSS 2 does do a great job, especially if you're using an NVIDIA GPU, I do recommend extracting the most out of DLSS 2. It is a great feature. And here's where at 4K, high settings DLSS quality, we're getting over 120 average FPS, and the minimums were very close to that average FPS, coming in at 110 versus the 7950 X3D setup. When you go higher in resolution, you're putting more strain on the GPU, which means less strain on the CPU, which means less of a difference between these two CPUs. The next title I decided to test here was Marvel's Midnight Sun, and here's where it decided to sort of lock us out of 1080p as we're using that 4K monitor, but we managed to get 87 average FPS. The 0.1% lows, however, were quite bad in this game, and they did improve somewhat on the 7950 X3D, but they were still quite bad, meaning this game's optimization could use a little bit of extra work, especially in the future if developers are using this engine and similar code in another game. But in this case, with this game set to high settings at 4K with DLSS on, we were scoring 87 average FPS, which is still absolutely fine and more than playable on turn-based games. Though the final game that we had here was Monster Hunter World. When it was first released, it was very graphically intensive. And of course, going with an RTX 4060 at 1080p, we decided to test this at high settings. Here's where we've got an average of 136, and the 0.1% lows were actually really impressive. Going on the 7950 X3D showed that we gained only 2 average FPS at 1080p, but going up to 4K with DLSS on showed, just like Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, showed a really good result. We're getting over 60 average FPS, and the differences between the 7950 X3D were virtually non-existent, but also the 0.1% lows were extremely close to that of the average FPS, meaning this was going to be an absolutely smooth experience at these settings. Now, of course, being a newer CPU, the 7950 X3D is going to have a slight power advantage, but because we've already undervolted that CPU, undervolted that GPU, it actually didn't amount to a whole lot of a difference. And in fact, the i7-9700 with that stock cooler undervolted was giving out really good temperatures across all three games. But there is still one thing I do want to test now, and that is to chuck in an RTX 3070 in this build and see what comes out of this upgrade and see if it works properly with this setup.
Seeing stars, I'm seeing stars.
And here's the finale for this PC. We've just finished testing the RTX 3070 installed, and we got some really good results here. And that is, in all three of the titles, when we tested the 4K DLSS results, we got around a 35 to 40% uplift in FPS. And then when we check out the game that used the most power consumption, that was Monster Hunter World, the max power consumption went from around 182 watts to around 259 watts. So the power consumption scaled pretty much accordingly, just like the FPS, so that's a really good bonus. And our 360 watt power supply, even though it's 400 watts, it's got 360 watts available on that 12 volt line. So I guess we should be looking at it that way. The power supply was still well within clearance of having enough headroom. Though here's where the enthusiast in me versus the person who would sell this PC have two conflicting opinions. And that is, for my personal use, I would definitely opt for the 3070 option, being the enthusiast who likes to undervolt, extract that value. But then if I was going to flip this PC, I'd actually put the 4060 back in, and that's mainly because of this GPU. If someone was to update to Windows 11, then they could reset the BIOS and delete the MSI Afterburner undervolt for the 3070, and that could cause the power consumption to essentially go up to levels that are maxing out the power supply. This could cause issues with the PC crashing and things that you don't want to deal with if you're selling a PC. But in terms of the motherboard itself, if they reset the BIOS, the good thing here is that the default power limits, which we unlocked earlier in the video, would then come back into play, and it wouldn't be so bad. It would protect the CPU as well as the motherboard from overheating. Anyhow, with all that out of the way, we've got the two options that I've presented in this video. You want to go with the enthusiast undervolt option, the 3070. It is going to give you such good price performance, some of the best that you'll get around 400 USD, because the 3070, ironically, I paid pretty much the exact same money as I did for that GPU as I did for the 4060. But then if you go with the 4060 option, you're still going to be getting great price performance, something that's really contemporary with an i7 and a 4060, and it's only coming in under 400 USD. And this price tag is what makes the used price performance scene just so good. We're saving so much money. If you were to go out and build a 4060 PC brand new, or go buy off a retailer from a pre-built, you'd be probably spending around 800 US dollars. That's pretty much double the price of what we spent here today. Now, of course, you're going to most likely get better upgradability. You're going to have a newer system with most likely a better warranty. But we're still pretty much saving half the money. And in 4 years' time, if we want to upgrade this system, we can then sell it for maybe 200 USD. And we've got $600 that we otherwise wouldn't have had with that PC that's got the upgradability to spend in the future and get a much better rig. So that's sort of my thinking with just building a PC for the now, extracting 100% of all the money that we're spending now, versus spending, say, more now and not getting your money's worth when it comes to the ultimate thing, and that is price performance. This is why I absolutely love used price performance. Now, the final thing is with this build, something that I really love about it, and something that I started doing years ago, was I started looking at this tech scene, and that we've got motherboard manufacturers from Intel's behalf locking limits in memory speeds and overclocking ability, not just on the motherboard, but also on the CPU, right? The i7 9700, we can't overclock it or get any extra performance out of it that side. And so I started looking at this through a different set of lenses, and that is Intel's giving us this limit. Why don't we just extract the most performance at that limit via undervolting, and they can keep their K licensing costs, they can keep their Z390 motherboard licensing costs, which they do charge actually quite a significant extra amount on for just the motherboard chipset itself. We can save all that money, and we can still extract great price performance. And that's exactly what we've done here today. And hopefully you guys enjoyed today's journey. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. Also let us know in the comment section below what you think of the i7 9700. The CPU alone, I don't think at its current market price it's worth getting on its own, but if you do find it in a deal like we did here today, then it is definitely worth it. I think the PC that we picked up today, the whole combo, was just screaming such good value for money. But if I was looking at the CPU alone, the i7 8700 is actually much more abundant and should actually give you very similar performance in games, as well as the fact that the weirdest thing is out of all this with the i7 8700 versus 9700 is that the 8700 is still, to this day, I believe, being made. It's not discontinued. As opposed to the 9700, that got discontinued quite a while ago, but also a lot of other 8th gen SKUs, of course, are discontinued, but the 8700, it's still going. Anyhow, guys, I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.